Hello everyone, welcome to the learning support video where we'll discuss the components of the integumentary system. Now, perhaps the most important thing that we could do as we uncover this particular topic is to talk about what the word integument means. Now, if you'd like to take notes with me, what I'd like to ask you to do is to create a box similar to what you see here on the screen. Now notice that we have four particular layers. And of these four layers, our second layer is relatively thin. So again, if you'd like to take notes with me, make sure that your second layer is just as thin. Now, the word integument in Latin means a few different things, and so let's record what that term actually means. And so integument means covering. It also refers to a coating of something. It could be used to refer to an enclosure. But more importantly, an overarching term is membrane. So if we wanted to pick one of these words to be the primary word or the primary description for what we're discussing when we talk about the integumentary system, it would be the word membrane. And so when we use this word membrane, it is referring to a protective layer. Again, a covering, a coating, or enclosure. And what the integument does is it protects the internal parts of us from the external things around us, or the things that we would find in the environment. Now, as we continue to explore the integumentary system, one of the things that we need to make note of is the fact that our integumentary system has two primary layers. And you're probably very familiar with these terms. Now, the first term we'll place in our very first box here, and that term is the epidermis. And the second term that I'd like us to focus on is dermis, and we'll place this word in our third box here. Now, the epidermis is probably the layer that we're most familiar with. If we think about it, this is the layer that we give the most attention to. Now, the epidermis is the skin that we see. It's what's on top. As a matter of fact, if we look at the word epidermis, the very beginning of it is epi. And that's what epi means. It means things that are on the surface or things that are on the top. And so we have our epidermis, again, what we're most familiar with. Now, with the epidermis, one of the things that's going to be important for us to uncover here is the fact that our epidermis could include either 4 or 5 different layers. Now, you may be asking, well, what's the differentiator between having 4 or 5 layers? We'll get there in just a moment. But for now, for our note-taking purposes, our epidermis will have either 4 or 5 layers. And so the epidermis will most likely have 4 layers if we're referring to what's called the thin skin. And our epidermis will most likely have 5 layers if we're referring to what's called the thick skin. So again, 4 layers gives us what we call the thin skin, and 5 layers gives us the thick skin. Now, when we talk about thick skin, we're referring to the skin that we find on the palm of our hands and on the soles of our feet. Everything else on our body, everything else as it relates to the epidermis, is thin skin. Now, the second layer that we've already labeled is the dermis, and we'll talk more about the importance of the dermis here in just a second. But in between our epidermis and our dermis, we have a very unique layer. And this layer is referred to as the dermal, epidermal, junction. And this dermal epidermal junction functions like a glue or an adhesive that binds both the epidermis and the dermis together. Now, we've got one box remaining, and this box that remains represents the surface underneath the dermis. And the surface that we're referring to here is called the hypodermis. And this hypodermis contains a connective tissue, which we call fat, or you may hear it referred to as adipose tissue. Now, let's uncover just a couple of more unique things about the epidermis and the dermis. Now, the epidermis is unique in the fact that this particular layer of tissue or this component of our skin does not have its own blood supply. So, again, if you're riding with me, let's make note of this, that the epidermis does not have its own blood supply. So what we're saying is that if our epidermis doesn't have its own blood supply, that also means that it doesn't have a lot of oxygen in that area either. And if this layer of tissue, or if this component of our skin doesn't have its own blood supply, and if it doesn't have a lot of oxygen, that probably means that it's dead. And that would actually be a correct representation of the epidermis. So what we're saying is that the skin we see, the skin that's on the exterior part of us, is actually dead skin. So the question becomes, well, if the epidermis doesn't have its own blood supply, why is it that we bleed if we have a cut on our skin? And the reason for that is because the epidermis receives blood supply from the dermis. And so the way that that happens is that blood goes from an area of high concentration, which is here in the dermis, to an area of low concentration, the epidermis. And so when we say that the epidermis has a low concentration of blood, we're again just referring to the fact that there's not a lot of blood supply there. And when we use the word high concentration, we're saying that the dermis does have a good amount of blood supply there. And so through a process that we call diffusion, blood goes from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. And so again, that term is called diffusion. So now that we have an idea about the layers and the components of the integumentary system, let's take just a few moments to discuss the functions of the integumentary system. Now, the first of the functions is one that we've already given some credibility, and that is the term protection. So remember just a moment ago, we said that the integumentary system protects the internal components of us from the things that are external to us or the things that are in the environment. And so we have to ask the question, well, what specifically does the integumentary system protect us from? So if we create a list, the first thing that we would note is that it protects us from UV rays. And specifically, when we talk about UV rays, we're referring to the sun. And so the component of our integumentary system that protects us from the sun is actually melanin. And it is the melanin that gives our skin its tone, its color, but it also has this protective mechanism as well. And so without melanin, our skin would become much more susceptible to sunburns. Our skin wouldn't have the characteristics that it normally has, and we more often than not see our skin seem to age very quickly. Another thing that we could put on our list here is the fact that our skin protects us from pathogens. And when we talk about pathogens, we're referring to things like bacteria, viruses, and fungi. And so, again, it's our skin that protects those things, those pathogens, from entering the body. Secondly, the integumentary system gives us the sense of sensation. In other words, it's going to do a few things for us. The integumentary system helps us to sense pain, it helps us to sense touch, and it's also helpful in giving us the sense of temperature. Thirdly, the integumentary system provides us with flexibility. In other words, it has the ability, our integument does, to stretch and to grow so that it fits with us. So we'll make note here that it gives us the ability to stretch and to grow as we develop. Now, the fourth function is excretion. And when we use the word excretion, all we're referring to is the fact that our integument helps to release things from the body. Now, a couple of those things that are released would be things like water, which we may be familiar with, but some other things include uric acid and also lactic acid. And so uric acid is actually produced during the breakdown of food. So if we consume things like beans, peas, and even beer, our skin or our integument helps to release uric acid. Now, for lactic acid, you're probably familiar with this, but if not, it is a byproduct of insufficient oxygen in the body. And that is something that oftentimes occurs during extreme or very intense exercise. And so we actually have the release of these two types of acids from the body. On top of that, one of the other things that's released from our integumentary system are electrolytes. So the fifth function here is vitamin D production. And so what the body does is it allows the integumentary system to synthesize vitamin D when our body is exposed to sunlight. In other words, what happens is that our body takes vitamin D from an inactive form and it helps it to become activated when we're exposed to sunlight. And so the integumentary system has a huge role in that particular function. The last thing that we'll talk about here as it relates to the functions of the integumentary system is that it also helps to maintain our body temperature. And we oftentimes refer to this as the homeostasis of body temperature. Now, this happens because of two processes. One is what we call vasodilation, and vasodilation refers to the fact that our blood vessels are going to enlarge. And by enlarging, our blood vessels help to release heat. In other words, vasodilation will be used to help cool the body when needed. And the other term here is vasoconstriction. And vasoconstriction helps us to conserve heat. So that's it for this learning support video. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.